According to modern-day apologists, they claim the Quran says Noah's flood was only a local event, not a global one. In reality, they say this because they believe the science is stronger for a local event. They will often then go on to cite archaeological evidence of how the flood could only be a local event, and brag about how the Bible got it wrong. Here are some well-known apologists making their claims.
And the time of Noah's time, if you calculate by genealogy, it comes to in the 21st to 22nd century BC. Archaeological evidence shows today that the 3rd dynasty of Babylon and 11th dynasty of Egypt were present at the 21st and 22nd century BC, and there was no evidence of flood, and they remain uninterrupted. Therefore, archaeological evidence shows us that it's impossible that the earth was submerged, the full earth was submerged under water in the 21st, 22nd century BC. What about the Quran? What about the Quran? Point number 1, Quran does not give a date. Whether 21st century BC or 50th century BC, no date. Point number 2, nowhere does the Quran say the full world was submerged under water. It speaks about Noah alayhi salam and his qawm and his people. A small group of people or maybe a large group of people. Archaeological evidences tell today, and the archaeologists they say that we have no objection. It's possible that parts of the world was submerged under water, but full world, it's not possible.
Here's a question. What is the Islamic view on Noah's flood? Does it differ from the accounts of other religions like Christianity and Judaism? And is there any evidence that such an event actually took place?
Well, the view in Christianity and Judaism is based on the biblical account in the book of Genesis, and the Quran's view is similar in that it basically has the Genesis story now in the Quran. One of the key differences is that well, maybe not a key difference, but nevertheless a curious difference, is that whereas in the Bible it is clearly stated that this is a universal flood, in the case of the Quran, it is not so clear it's a universal flood. In fact, it doesn't seem like it's a universal flood, more like a local flood inflicted on the people who disobeyed God's message.
In reference to Noah's flood, although it is true the Quranic narrative does not explicitly state that the flood was a global event that drowned all life on earth. In the same vein, nor does it explicitly say it was only a local event that only drowned specific people living in a certain geographical area. If anything, when taking all the verses together cumulatively, it gives more indication that it was a global flood, which is why many classical Quranic exegetes believed that it was a global flood. They came to this conclusion based on 2 lines of evidence. Firstly, the flood narrative, as mentioned in the Quran, has no explicit counterposition to say it was only a local flooding. The dearth of authenticated hadith on this matter and the Quranic verses are open to a reading that the flood was a global event. Secondly, Muhammad and early Muslim scholars had no issue with taking accounts from Jews and Christians. The sources came to be known as Israeliyat. As the story found in the Quran is taken from the Bible with some deviations, the flood narrative, as mentioned in the biblical and exegetical traditions of the Jews and Christians, is explicitly described as a global event. Although this view is being revised within some sections, it still does not detract from the point that the ancient rabbis believed in a worldwide flood and they knew the Hebrew text well. Why incorporating Israeliyat became important for Muslims was because it gave many historical details that were absent from the Quran and the Hadith of Muhammad. So for the medieval Quranic exegetes, they filled in the details of the Quranic narrative with these latter biblical and exegetical traditions. It was natural for them to do this because the Quranic narratives were revealed against the backdrop of the biblical stories that were already circulating among the Jews and Christians at the time of Muhammad, who taught his companions that there was no harm in relating these biblical stories, as this hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari shows. In fact, the Quran does indeed give the impression that it was a global flood. In chapter 54, verses 11 to 12, the flood caused the earth to burst with springs. And in 3777, all of the people living contemporary to Noah had died except for a few. So in full, Quran 54:11 to 12 says, "Then we opened the gates of the heaven with rain pouring down and caused the earth to burst with springs, and the waters met for a matter already determined." And Quran 37:77 says, "And we made his," meaning Noah's, "descendants remain." From the aforementioned verses, the classical commentators of the Quran derived their conclusion that all humans died except Noah's family. This means it was a global flood. For example, Tafsir Jalalain says about Quran 37:77, "All humans died except for Noah and some members of his family." This can only happen if it were a global catastrophe. All humans are now descendants from Noah. On Quran 37:77, Ibn Abbas said, "It means none remained except the descendants of Noah." Qatada said, "Thus all people are from the descendants of Noah." Ibn Kathir, another highly influential historian and exegete, concurs with earlier scholars. On 37:77 he says, "And his progeny, them we made the survivors." Ali ibn Abi Talha reported that Ibn Abbas, may Allah be pleased with him, said, "There was no one left apart from the offspring of Nuh, peace be upon him." Sa'id ibn Abi Aruba said, narrating from Qatada concerning the ayah or verse, "All people descended from the offspring of Nuh, peace be upon him." A foremost and prominent figure in the area of Quranic exegesis is at-Tabari, known for his historical works and his expertise in Quranic commentary. He says in his The History of at-Tabari, Volume 1, General Introduction and From the Creation to the Flood, page 362 to 363, about the flood, that the water, and quote, "It rose 15 cubits above the highest mountain on earth. The ark carried them around the entire earth in 6 months. It did not come to rest anywhere until it came to the sacred territory of Mecca and Medina. However, it did not enter the sacred territory but circled around for a week." End quote. It then goes on to say, after the ark had circled around the sacred territory, it travelled with those aboard over the earth and eventually reached Al-Judi, which is a mountain. Finally, it says, the water that came down from heaven became the oceans that are seen on earth today. End quote. So clearly, at-Tabari is saying the flood was a global event, as the flood water covered the highest mountain on earth, and Noah circled around the earth for 6 months until finally settling on Mount Judi. There are further Quranic verses that indicate it was a global flood. In Quran 71:26 to 27 it says, "And Noah said, O my Lord, leave not of the unbelievers a single one on earth, for if thou dost leave any of them, they will mislead thy devotees, and they will breed none but wicked, ungrateful ones." Noah's plea does not fit in well with the local flood, since his request was that no evildoer be left on the earth, not just locally within close proximity of his land, but anywhere on earth. A local flood would entail the fact that not only did evildoers survive, but that they also possibly had offspring who were wicked, ungrateful ones, something Noah prayed against. Clearly, this passage fits in better with a global event. Islamic study and academic sources, taking their references from the Quran and its associated commentaries, state it was a global flood. In this article, it goes on to conclude the interior of the earth moved in a strange way, and the ocean's floors lifted suddenly, flooding the dry land. The earth, for the first time, was submerged. A ship cannot end up on a mountain if it was only a local flood. Although differing from the biblical view, the Quran says the ship of Noah ended up on Mount Judi, whereas the Bible references Mount Ararat. Quran 11:44 says, "And it was said, O earth, swallow your water, and O sky, withhold your rain. And the water subsided, and the matter was accomplished, and the ship came to rest on the mountain of Judi. And it was said, away with the wrongdoing people." Here is a picture of Mount Judi in current-day Turkey, which has an elevation of 6,854 feet. In Genesis 8:3-4, it says the waters abated after 150 days, and in the 7th month the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. Genesis 8:5 says that the tops of the mountains were seen in the 10th month. Mount Ararat is also in Turkey. Its highest elevation point is 16,854 feet. Curiously, it is exactly 10,000 feet difference from Mount Judi. There are revisionist theories that state Mount Judi is just one mountain from the mountain range in the broader area of the mountain plains of Ararat, situated in modern-day Turkey, similar to how the Himalayas consist of a range of mountains. However, a more compelling evidence of the Quranic tradition of where it got Mount Judi from is that it was likely taken from earlier Christian legends that identified Mount Judi as the landing site of the Ark. This idea persisted in Syriac and Armenian traditions throughout late antiquity, but was later abandoned for the tradition equating the biblical location of Mount Ararat. The Armenians did not historically and traditionally associate Noah's landing site with Mount Ararat, known natively as Massis, until the 11th century, who continued to associate Noah's Ark with Mount Judi. The term Judi originates from the Syriac word meaning mounds or elevations. During pre-Islam, the Syrians of the eastern part of the Tigris River believed in the legend of the Ark resting on Mount Judi in the land of Card. This legend may in origin have been independent of the Genesis account of Noah's flood, rooted in the more general Near Eastern flood legends, but following Christianization of the Syrians from about the 2nd century AD, it became associated with the mountains of Ararat where Noah landed according to the book of Genesis. For more research on this, consider reading the works of Dr. Frederick Cornwallis Conybeare, who was a Fellow of University College, Oxford, an expert on the Armenian Church, and was Professor of Theology at the University of Oxford. According to Eridu Genesis pictured here, which is an ancient Sumerian religious epic, deities fashioned humankind from clay to cultivate the land and ground, care for flocks, and perpetuate the worship of the gods. Cities were soon built, but then the gods determined to destroy humankind with a flood because of their disobedience. The deity Enki did not agree with the decree, who revealed to Ziusudra, a man well known for his humility and obedience, to build a boat. Ziusudra did as Enki commanded. in which he successfully rode out the flood. Afterward, he prostrated himself before the gods and an Enlil, and as a reward for living a godly life, the Asudra was given immortality. From the ancient flood myths, a more well-known one is the Epic of Gilgamesh. The tablets date to around 700 BC, but are based upon earlier fragments of the flood story found on tablets dating from 2100 BC. In this Babylonian story, it is Utnapishtim and his wife who are the survivors of the mythological flood, having preserved human and animal life in the great boat he built. The ark settled on Mount Nisir, about 300 miles from Mount Ararat. Utnapishtim sent out a dove, then a swallow, but neither could find land, so returned. Then he sent out a raven, which did not return. Great flood tales appear in many different Greek and Roman documents. A fuller account of a flood story is from a Greek legend recounted in Ovid's Metamorphoses, in which Deucalion, who is the equivalent of Noah and the son of Prometheus, in the story Zeus, the king of the gods, resolved to destroy all humanity by a flood because of their disobedience. Deucalion constructed an ark in which he and his wife rode out the flood and landed on Mount Parnassus. According to Indian flood mythology, Manu was the sole survivor of the Great Flood, mentioned in ancient commentaries of the Vedas, with conservative estimates dating it to 700 BC, but many experts believe it to be much older. The Shatapatha Brahmana recounts how Manu was warned by a fish, to whom he had shown kindness, that a flood would destroy the whole of humanity. He therefore built a boat, and when the flood came, he tied this boat to the fish and was safely steered to a resting place on top of a mountain top. When the flood receded, Manu, the sole human survivor, performed a sacrifice by pouring oblations of butter and sour milk into the waters. So in conclusion, modern-day apologists claim the Quran says Noah's flood was only a local event, not a global one. However, most classical scholars say it was a global flood based upon their understanding of the Quran. In reality, modern-day apologists disagree with classical scholars because they believe to say it was a local flood is more scientifically accurate than a global flood. This is also in part of their unhealthy zeal in wanting to distance themselves from the biblical narrative by being quick to point out its errors, thereby trying to elevate the Quran over it by manipulating the Quranic verses to fit it with modern understanding. Unwittingly, in so doing, they are rejecting other verses that show the Quranic account that indicate that it may be a global flood, and also rejecting over 1,000 years of orthodox Islamic scholarship. There is nothing miraculous about the flood story as found in the Quran. It seems to be an allegory which, as a motif, is found in many cultures and religions prior to Islam. The Quran simply took the story from Genesis and ancient Christian legends and embellished it, as many cultures did before and since.